Hello everyone. Welcome to the 2021 ACOM seminar series. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Erin McDuffie. She is a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellows and a visiting research associate at the Atmospheric Composition Analysis Group at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. Erin got her BA in chemistry at Carleton College in Minnesota, and she got her PhD in chemistry at the University of Colorado Boulder. She was affiliated with CIRIS, the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, and conducted her graduate research with Dr. Steve Brown and Noah in the Chemical Science Laboratory. She did her postdoc in Canada, in Halifax, at the Department of Physics and Atmospheric Science at Dalhousie University with Dr. Randall Martin. And she continues to have a joint affiliation with Dr. Martin's group in the Department of Energy, Environmental and Chemistry and Chemical Engineering at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. Many of you might know Erin as she did a lot of measurement campaigns in the recent years, such as Winter, Frappe, and Discover AQ, and she measured NOx and ozone and N2O5. And today in her talk, she will tell us about why we should care about emission inventories and about how global sources of air pollution impact public health. Before starting, I would like to remind you that you can enter your questions down below where you're watching right now. You can enter your question at any time, and I will read those questions at the end of the talk. And with that, I introduce you to Dr. Erin McDuffie.
Great, thank you so much, Ale. And I'm gonna turn my camera off so that you can see my whole screen. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me to give this seminar. As Ale just mentioned, I am currently a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the EPA. However, today I'm speaking to you in my capacity as a visiting research associate at Washington University in St. Louis. And so the majority of today's talk is going to be about global sources and of air pollution and their public health impacts. This was work that I largely did as a postdoctoral research fellow at Dalhousie and Washington University in St. Louis. And then I'll spend the last few minutes talking about a few more details about air pollutant and greenhouse gas emission inventories. So before I get started, I do want to thank my many co-authors and collaborators who have helped contribute to this work. And so I'll go through each one of these areas in more detail as we go on, but I particularly want to thank Randall Martin and Michael Brower, who were the PIs on this project. Okay, so I want to first start off today by showing you a map that is highlighting how long-term exposure to ambient PM2.5 can lead to premature mortality. So here is data from the 2019 Global Burden of Disease Project, so the latest version of the GBD, and each country is colored by the absolute number of deaths attributable to long-term exposure to PM2.5. And when you consider total number of deaths across all countries compared to the global total, air pollution, specifically outdoor PM2.5, is responsible for roughly 7% of all global deaths. So if we want to ultimately improve air quality, reduce the number of attributable deaths, we need to, of course, reduce our exposure to PM2.5. But that's challenging because PM2.5 is ubiquitous around the world. So now I'm showing a similar figure, but this is now a high resolution map of 1 by 1 kilometer PM2.5 surface concentrations on an annual average basis. So again, if we ask the same question, well, if we want to reduce mortality, we need to reduce concentrations. How do we reduce concentrations? Again, the answer to that is fairly complicated because PM2.5 is made up of multiple chemical components, and PM2.5 is also emitted from both primary, so direct emission sources, as well as secondary sources or chemical reactions in the atmosphere. And so we can use measurements to help answer this question, where is PM2.5 coming from? because if I back up for a second, if we can identify dominant sources of PM 2.5, we can start to develop effective mitigation strategies. And so, as I just mentioned, measurements can be helpful because if you're measuring the chemical composition of PM 2.5, you can, in some cases, back out the sources of where that mass is coming from. However, for the study that I showed on the first slide, for the global burden of disease, they were focused on long-term exposure, so annual average exposure to PM 2.5 mass. And as I say here, measurements are useful, but long-term measurements are extremely limited. And not only long-term measurements of chemical speciation, but also just long-term measurements of total PM 2.5 mass. So to illustrate that point, I'm showing here a figure from one of Randall Martin's recent papers where they did an assessment of the number of long-term surface monitors at sites around the world. And the color scale here is showing the number of PM 2.5 monitors per million people. And in many countries, the number of monitors only max out around 10 monitors per million people. But all of the gray countries here that you're seeing actually don't have a single long-term monitor. And that comes out to around 60% of all world countries. So in a scenario where we have extremely limited long-term annual average surface measurements of PM 2.5, that limits our ability to use measurements alone to identify dominant sources of this pollution. So that leads to the study that I'll be talking about today, which was part of an HEI or Health Effects Institute funded study called the Global Burden of Disease Major Air Pollution Sources, or GBD MAPS project. And the goal of this study was to identify major sources of global PM 2.5 and then link those sources of pollution to their health impacts. So quantify the attributable disease burden. So here I'm going to show the overall methodology, but I will go into more detail on each of these steps in the following slides. So the first three steps here that I'm showing are that we first developed a custom updated air pollution emission inventory that we then input into the GeoSchem 3D chemical transport model in order to run a series of emission sensitivity simulations. The next series of steps involved integrating these sensitivity simulations with PM 2.5 exposure estimates and then health data from the GBD in order to quantify source-specific disease burdens. So this is outlining the overall general approach to our study. But as I mentioned, I'll next go through each one of these steps in a little bit more detail. So starting out with method one. So as I mentioned previously, the first step was actually to develop our own detailed air pollutant emissions inventory. And to do that, we ended up using the Community Emissions Data System. And so this is an emissions system that was developed by researchers out of PNNL, including Steve Smith and Rachel Hoseley. So you can read about the original SEDS system in Rachel's 2018 GMD paper. And so what we ended up doing for our study was working with the SEDS developers to update the SEDS system to extend the emissions from 2014, which was the latest year in the original version, out to 2017. And we had started this study in 2018. So at that point, it was only current year -1. And we also worked with the developers to split out detailed sectoral information as well as fuel type information. And so in the end, what we produced was a gridded anthropogenic emissions inventory that had emissions extending from 1970 to 2017 for 7 major air pollutants. And the details of that study, or of the details of the emission inventory, are in my 2020 ESSD paper. So I just wanted to next talk a little bit about how SEDS actually works. This is a bottom-up emissions inventory. And so most generally speaking, the first part of the SEDS system is to estimate default emissions as a function of country, sector, fuel type, year, and chemical compound. Most generally speaking, bottom-up inventories are essentially an activity data or an activity factor, such as the amount of fuel used in a particular sector or vehicle miles traveled, for instance, multiplied by an emissions factor. So in this example, how many kilograms of black carbon is emitted per kilograms of fuel used in a particular sector. So that's the general approach to calculate default estimates for all countries. CEDS is then fairly unique in that it uses a harmonization approach to scale the default estimates to regionally or nationally available inventories. And the idea there is that regional or nationally developed inventories will have more regionally or nationally accurate information compared to just these default estimates. And so this map here is showing or highlighting for each country what regional inventory those emissions were scaled to in the CEDS system. So for example, over the US, we're scaling to the US NEI inventory. In Canada, we're scaling to their national inventory. And then my contribution to this work was I actually incorporated the DICE Africa inventory. So we're scaling African countries to that inventory. And then I also worked with our collaborators in India to integrate an updated Indian emission inventory as well that we scaled CEDS to. And then the last step, and there are more steps here, this is a generalization, but the last major step of the CEDS system is the gridding. So after we calculate emissions for each country, we then have to spatially allocate those. And we do that to a 0.5 by 0.5 degree grid cell. And in this example, I'm showing that we're using the Edgar emissions for NOx for road transportation, for instance, to disaggregate our CEDS emissions from that sector. So that is generally how the CEDS system works. Now, the next few slides, I'm just going to show a few results from this inventory. So first, I'm showing here the 7 major atmospheric pollutants that are predicted or calculated with this system. And the black line in each plot is showing the results from the updated CEDS system. The dashed gray line is showing the original CEDS system that was published in Rachel Hosley's paper. And then the dashed blue lines are the Edgar inventory, and the red dots are emission estimates from the Gaines model. And then the colors here are representing the contributions from different source sectors. And these are for the updated CEDS version. So you can see, for instance, that ammonia emissions are largely from the agricultural sector. SO2 emissions are largely from energy generation and industrial processes. And then you can see, for example, transportation has a larger contribution to NOx and CO, and then you have a large residential contribution to black carbon and organic carbon. We also have this information as a function of fuel type, and this was one of the unique aspects of this inventory at the time it was developed. This was the first global inventory that provided publicly available fuel type emissions information. So we have 4 fuel types that we broke out. And again, I'll just go through a few examples where you can see that, again, ammonia emissions, which are largely from agricultural sources, those fall into this, what I'm calling a process fuel. So these are largely non-combustion sources of emissions. But then for SO2, where energy and industry were large sources, you have a much larger contribution from coal, which is kind of this medium gray color. For NOx, you can see the largest contribution from liquid oil and natural gas. And then for BC and OC, you again see a relatively larger contribution from solid biofuel or biomass combustion. And then finally, I now want to show a figure that's showing the time series not as a function of sector or fuel type, but actually by world region. And I want to show this just to highlight the importance of using a contemporary emissions inventory in the type of study that I'll be talking about today. So for instance, if you look at these red curves in each plot, these show the emission trends for China. And you can see that China, well, they implemented strict mitigation policies in the around 2010, in some cases 2012, and you can see that they've had a large decrease in their emissions of many of these pollutants in recent years. And so if you're using an inventory that is even a few years old for these emission sensitivity simulations that I'll talk about on the next slide, those simulations might not be representing current chemical conditions if you are predicting that there are more or less emissions in a particular region than there might be. Okay, finally moving on to method 2. So talked a lot about the emissions that go that we're using as an input into the model. But the model that we're actually using is the GeoSchem 3D chemical transport model. GeoSchem essentially solves for or represents all of these different processes in the atmosphere using assimilated meteorology from the NASA GeoSmer 2 product. Again, using the SEDS emissions as anthropogenic emission inputs, and represents all these processes in order to solve for local chemical concentrations of various compounds. And we're, for our study, interested in the compounds that make up PM2.5. So the particular version of GeoSchem that I was running was GeoSchem Classic. It had 219 species with 645 reactions. And I was running both a global simulation at about 220 by 280 kilometer resolution, but I was also running 3 nested simulations over North America, Asia, and Europe that had a much higher resolution. So I wanted to next show an evaluation of the base case simulation of this model. So here in this first figure, I'm actually showing in the lighter colored bars the components of PM2.5, so nitrate, ammonium sulfate, etc. The components of PM2.5 relative to the surface observations that we do have available of long-term PM2.5 composition. And the light bars are the default version of GeoSchem if you were to pull it out of the box and run it. And at this point in time, this was the version in fall of 2018. So this was version 12.1. I think we're now up into version 13. So in the default version, I ended up implementing updates to N2O5 chemistry based on my PhD. These are now standard in the current version of the GeoSchem model. I also updated wet and dry deposition based on literature recommendations at the time, and then of course updated the emissions inventory. And so the darker bars are showing the agreement or the normalized mean bias compared to observations of the same chemical components. And you can see that this large inorganic nitrate and ammonium bias is very much reduced in the updated version of the model. You now have slight underpredictions in some of these other compounds, but in general, you can see that the model is predicting an annually average speciation that is very similar to what we actually have in the available observations. And then showing one more comparison for total PM2.5 mass. I'm showing here on the vertical axis, the simulated annual average concentrations of PM2.5 against our available observations. We have about 4,000 available observations for the year 2017 when I was running these simulations. And the various points are colored by the region. So you can see that most of the data we have are in Asia. These are largely China, as well as Europe and North America. But we can see that overall, for the data that we do have, we have a normalized mean bias of about 5% overall. Okay, so those were the emissions and the model that we used for our emission sensitivity simulations. How we actually conducted these simulations was that we were running brute force or zero out simulations, which means that we ran a base simulation with all sources included. We then systematically removed each emission source and then compared the amount of PM2.5 that was produced in that simulation compared to the base simulation, and that was the amount of PM2.5 from our source, from that particular source. So we ended up testing 25 different fuel and source combinations, which ended up requiring 100 individual 13-month model simulations. And it included 100 because, again, we were running one global simulation and then 3 nested simulations for North America, Asia, and Europe. But this provided fractional source contribution information at global, national, and subnational scales. So before I go into the health impact analysis, I want to jump quickly to a few results to show you some of the results from the sensitivity simulations themselves. So here I'm showing a pie chart that's showing the global sector contributions to average population weighted PM 2.5 mass. I should say annually averaged. So you can see that residential combustion was a large source of PM 2.5, as well as dust, and then industry and energy. And this is on the global scale. Of course, we also have this in terms of fuel type information. So solid biomass contributed to about 20% of globally averaged PM 2.5 population weighted. Fossil fuels, so coal plus oil and gas, contributed to about 27%. And then you had roughly 50% contributions from dust and fires, and then remaining largely non-combustion sources. We also have this source-specific information not only at the global and national level, which I'll show in a few slides, but we can get this information essentially down to the scale of the model. So I'm calling this the subnational scale. And these results show that dominant sectors vary regionally and within countries. And the detailed spatial resolution that we have in these results can provide increased policy relevant information. So for instance, if we just focus in on the US for a moment, we can see that in the Western US, we have dominant contributions from open fires, which in this case are wildfires. And sorry, I should take a step back and say that this is showing the modeled results where each grid cell is colored by the particular sector that is contributing the most to PM 2.5 in that grid cell. So open fires or wildfires are the dominant source of PM 2.5 in the Western US. You can see that in the more arid Southwest, you have contributions from dust. You start getting larger contributions from transportation, agriculture, and energy generation as you start moving into the Midwest and, the Midwest and Eastern US. And then the Southeast, where you have this light gray color, this is the remaining sources category, but in this case, this is from biogenic SOA. We not only have detailed spatial information from this study, we also have detailed fuel and sector information, which again can provide increased policy relevant information. So here in this figure now, I'm showing the fuel type, the combustion fuel type that's contributing the most to PM 2.5. And this is not colored by grid cell anymore, this is colored by country. But I've highlighted here a few regions, primarily South Africa, Eastern and Central Europe, as well as parts of Asia, where coal is actually the largest combustion fuel source of PM 2.5. But we not only ran sensitivity simulations to coal, we actually tested coal combustion in different sectors. And so what we found was that in South Africa and these parts of Europe, coal use for energy generation was actually a larger source of PM 2.5 than coal use for the industrial sector. And then the opposite was actually true for these regions throughout Asia, where coal use in the industrial sector was actually a larger source than coal use in the energy sector. So again, providing more detailed sectoral and fuel information can provide increased policy relevant information. Okay, so now going back to our methods. The last part of this study is connecting these sensitivity simulations to their health impacts. And the first step is actually to calculate the absolute contribution to PM 2.5 from each source. So we're not actually using the modeled absolute amount of PM 2.5 in this study. The model is only telling us the relative contribution of each source. we are calculating, or to calculate the absolute contribution of each source to PM 2.5, we are using high resolution exposure estimates that are from the GBD and then downscaled to 1 by 1 kilometer using recent satellite derived PM 2.5 estimates from Randall Martin's group that was recently led by Melanie Hammer. So these downscaled exposure estimates, or PM 2.5 concentration results, these data tell us that annual population weighted mean PM 2.5 concentrations, at least globally speaking, the global average is around 42 micrograms per meter cubed, which I just wanted to point out because this is 8 times higher than the recently updated WHO guidelines for annual average PM 2.5 exposure. So that's how we calculate the absolute source contributions. And then finally, the last step is actually connecting to the health impact analysis. And so to do that last part of the analysis, we use this general equation that's shown here, where the disease burden, the PM 2.5 disease burden in each country is calculated as the baseline mortality, or total number of deaths occurring in each country due to a particular disease, multiplied by the fraction that can be attributable to PM 2.5 exposure. So just to give you a little bit more detail, for this baseline mortality piece, I'm showing here an example for China, where you have the total number of deaths occurring as a function of age and a function of 6 different diseases. So again, these are all causes of death in China for these diseases, associated with these diseases. Now we multiply these baseline mortality numbers by the fraction attributable to PM 2.5, which is calculated as 1 minus 1 over the relative risk associated with a particular level of exposure. So this relative risk is calculated using concentration response functions, which I'm showing here. Again, these are from the latest version of the Global Burden of Disease Project. And how you should read these curves is that, for instance, you have a 1.5 greater risk of developing and dying from COPD or ischemic heart disease if you are exposed to an annual average concentration of 60 micrograms per meter cubed. So those are the 2 components of this calculation. So summed up over all diseases and all countries, we end up getting a result which is very similar to what I showed you on the first slide, where we have each country colored by the absolute number of deaths. You can see that India and China really stand out here in terms of absolute numbers. And globally speaking, there are about 3.8 million deaths attributable to PM 2.5 exposure in 2017. This, of course, doesn't answer the question of, well, where is this mass coming from? That was the first question I posed today. But we can now combine these results with the modeled fractional source contributions to answer that question. So first, I'm showing you the same results that I showed a few slides ago, these pie charts for sectoral and fuel type contributions on the global scale to the global annual average. And so now you can take the fractions for each source or each fuel type multiplied by the total number of deaths. And when you do that, for example, for fossil fuels, which was, as a reminder, 27% contribution, you end up with about 1 million deaths attributable to fossil fuel combustion in the year 2017. This last pie chart here is then just showing the contributions from the different diseases in the health impact analysis. So you can see that ischemic heart disease and stroke were the largest sources on for a global average. As I mentioned previously, we also have these results at the national level, and so I just wanted to show examples of some of the top countries that had the highest number of attributable deaths. So in this figure, I already mentioned that China and India very much stand out. And so in China, you had about 1.4 million deaths attributable to PM 2.5, closer to 900,000 deaths in India. But when you start looking at the source contributions, you can start seeing differences where you have a much larger contribution from residential energy and biofuel combustion in India compared to China, where you have a relatively larger contribution from coal and industry and energy. The next top 3 countries were Indonesia, Egypt, and Pakistan. And again, you can start seeing some regional differences or national differences in the source contributions. You can see an even larger residential and solid biofuel contribution in Indonesia. And then when you move to Egypt, which is much more arid and near the Sahara, you see a very large contribution from windblown dust. And then finally, rounding out the top 9 countries, I realize this is a lot of information, but you have Russia, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and then the United States coming in at number 9. And I'll just point out a few more key items where Nigeria, again, you see this very large contribution from windblown dust compared to some of the other regions. And then for the US in particular, we have a much larger relative contribution of liquid oil and natural gas. We also have a much larger relative contribution from the transportation sector as compared especially to the residential sector. And then of course, relatively large contributions from industry, energy, and agriculture. So I hope that that gave you a sense for the amount of information that's available in this type of study. And I could spend a few slides comparing our results to other studies that have used the similar approach, because we are definitely not the first ones. But I instead wanted to note that due to differences in essentially every step of the methodology or different uncertainties in the various steps, it makes it very difficult to quantitatively compare different studies. So for instance, you can have differences in the emission inventory that you're using or the simulation year that you're running. Of course, the chemical transport model is going to cause differences in the amount of PM2.5 predicted. You can also have differences in your exposure estimates. So whether or not you're using the model predicted total PM2.5 mass or satellite derived exposure estimates. And then you can also have differences in the health impact analysis where you're using differences in baseline mortality or different concentration response functions. So all of these combined, as I mentioned, make it difficult to quantitatively compare previous studies. But I think it also highlights the point that it's very important with these types of studies to make your, what I'm calling project assets, publicly available. And making these assets available can help increase the transparency and reproducibility of a study, as well as the potential use in decision making. So to this point, all of the methods and results, of course, are published in an accompanying or in the associated manuscript, which was published in Nature Communications earlier this year. All of our assets are linked to this paper, but they all each have their own DOI as well. So we've published the model source code, the SED scripts are available, the input data sets that we used, the analysis scripts, the results, those are all available online with DOIs. And then finally, as a last step, we also developed a public data visualization site. And so I just wanted to show that here on this next slide. Oops, if I can get this to play. Oops. Sorry, here we go. Okay, so this is a video of me showing the visualization site, which is linked at this URL in the top right. There's a lot of information about the GBD Maps project, including additional links to the input data and published analysis scripts. However, there's also information about how to use this tool. So in case you have questions, you can refer to that tab. But then the heart of the tool is the Explore the Data tab. You can look at results in terms of contributions to PM2.5 or their health impacts. For air pollution, for instance, I'm scrolling through an example where I'm looking at the contributions for fuel, looking specifically at coal. contributions to PM2.5 in various countries. You can look at maps or bar plots or tables. And then if you hover over individual countries, you can get their stats as well. You can also, also showing an example where you can look at all of the different source sectors as well. So here's an example, I believe, for energy. You can see again, South Africa kind of stands out in this example. So you can also zoom in on a particular location or country. So for instance, we're sticking with South Africa in this example, and you can look at the relative contributions of different fuels, which was the previous pie chart, or sectors, which I'm showing in this pie chart. And then you essentially have the same options for the health impact tab, but you can, in this case, actually choose which concentration response functions to use. So all of the results that I was showing in this presentation use the 2019 GBD data. However, there are other options. And again, you can look at results as a function of region or country. You can look at absolute number, which I was showing in my presentation. So again, you can really see India and China stand out. You can also select between 2017 or the year 2019, and again, look at bar plots of different countries. Here I'm just changing back to rate, so it's easier to compare. But you can look at bar plots or maps of different countries. And again, zooming in on different regions or different countries. So I think I'm gonna go back to, South Africa, stick with that example. And we can see the attributable deaths from different sectors in this example. And I believe this is the last example I'll show, yes, contributions from different fuel types. And then if you have any questions about this tool or about the data, there is a contact us button that has a GBD Maps email address. So feel free to reach out to me or to that email address if you have additional questions as you're perusing this site. Okay, so that ends the kind of first part of the talk, which was focused largely on my postdoctoral work. And the last few minutes, I'm now going to spend talking about a few more details about emissions inventories. And so this part of the talk is largely informed by my experience so far as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. But I do want to say that in no way does this reflect, of course, the opinions of the EPA. So just these are my personal observations, we'll say, that I'm sharing with you. So with that being said, why care about emission inventories? Well, if we just think back to the last 30 minutes that we shared together, I spent a lot of time talking about a lot of different aspects of this particular study. Sorry, I'll turn my laser back on. And this study, the success of this study would not have been possible without using the latest available science on detailed air pollutant inventories or geochem modeling, satellite-derived estimates, or health data. However, the policy relevant or mitigation relevant information from this study is rooted in the source and fuel contributions. And that information comes from the emission inventories. You don't get that information from the modeling, the exposure estimates, or the health data. So emission inventories can provide both scientific and mitigation relevant information. However, emission estimates are not settled science. I think it's far from the case. So for instance, for bottom-up inventories, again, here I'm just showing the overall SEDS methodology because I think it's a good example of areas where there are challenges still in bottom-up inventories. Largely in collecting accurate and appropriate input data across sources, compounds, and regions. So for instance, how much fuel, not only how much fuel, but what type of fuel is being burned when and where, what are the emission factors, which depend on the available technology, whether any abatement strategies are in place, the particular chemical compound. There's a lot of detail required here. And then it's not only on certain what the absolute emissions are in many cases, but where they're actually occurring. So there's a whole other host of challenges associated with gridding national inventories. For air pollutant inventories as well, there's also no global methodological standard for developing these inventories. And so most generally, the bottom-up inventories are following similar approaches, but they're using, there are subtle differences that can lead to differences like you're seeing here in total global emission estimates from multiple different inventories. Again, Edgar, Gaines, and then 2 versions of SEDS. And not only do these pollutants, of course, impact air quality, like I just showed in my previous slides, but these air pollutants are also relevant to climate. So I apologize that this is blurry here. This is one of the figures from the latest IPCC physical science basis reports showing the effective radiative forcing impacts from various different components or chemical compounds. I'm highlighting here the air pollutant compounds that we're talking about and showing their impact on effective radiative forcing. And then the color here is showing how those impacts are being made, essentially. So SO2, organic carbon, black carbon, ammonia, these impacts are largely associated with aerosol feedbacks. So to help better understand the science, impacts, and mitigation options of these compounds, which can also be called short-lived climate forcers, the IPCC is actually in the process of developing a methodology report for these short-lived climate forcers, or SLCFs. So the 49th session of the IPCC approved that the IPCC Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories, or the TFI, produce this methodology report. How they're actually going about doing this. Right now, they're collecting information on existing air pollutant methods. They're hosting a series of expert meetings. The most recent were the middle 2 weeks in October, and I was participating in those meetings as well. There'll be a report from that meeting published in March of next year. And then after they gather information, they are going to develop an outline for the report. Upon approval of the outline by the panel, then comes the development of the report, which will probably come in the AR7 cycle. And the intent here with all of this work is to develop a guidance framework for the short-lived climate forcer emissions that's similar to existing reports for global or for national greenhouse gas emissions. So in contrast to air pollutant inventories, greenhouse gases, for greenhouse gases, there already is a global standard for how to develop national GHG inventories. And so just to provide a little bit more information about that, the IPCC has national greenhouse gas inventory guidelines. The most recent version is the 2006 guidelines, and then there are refinements that were approved in 2019. These reports consist of 5 volumes that have general guidance and reporting information, and then chapters that are specific, or volumes that are specific to energy, industry processes and product use, agriculture, forestry, and other land use, and waste. And so what's in these reports are essentially guidelines and what's called good practice guidance that specify 3 different tiers that can be used with increasing methodological complexity in order to calculate emissions. And so the idea is that a tier 1 approach is the simplest approach that in theory could be used by any country to develop an inventory of greenhouse gases for that particular country. I do want to point out, without going into too much detail here, these methodology reports do undergo the same review process as IPCC scientific assessments. So there is a formal review process. And also point out that emission experts do play a role in developing these guidelines. It's important to understand that these guidelines exist because they do have, especially in the context of potentially new SLCF guidelines, because there is a direct policy relevance. So under the reporting requirements of the Enhanced Transparency Framework, which is Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, developing countries will be required to submit greenhouse gas inventories following the 2006 IPCC GHG guidelines at least every 2 years, starting in the year 2024. And so many of these countries will need to build their capacity for reporting national greenhouse gas emissions by that time. Now, developed countries under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change are required to develop and report annual greenhouse gas emission inventories. Currently, that the UNFCCC was ratified in the early 1990s by 197 countries. So the US, for instance, annually reports an inventory on greenhouse gases. However, developed countries will continue to be required to submit their annual inventories under the Paris Agreement as well. And so I do want to note that there are possible benefits and challenges in thinking about potentially increasing coordination efforts between air pollutant and greenhouse gas inventory development, especially in developing countries that are currently in the process of setting up their greenhouse gas systems. It might be beneficial to also consider setting up air pollutant inventory systems at the same time. And some of these ideas are discussed in a paper that Steve Smith, Molly Charles, and I are preparing, which should be submitted soon to ACP. So lastly, I want to end with some additional challenges and for emission inventories for both air pollutant and greenhouse gas inventories. And I think this is relevant to this audience because this deals with the role of atmospheric observations in developing these national emission inventories. So first, I want to point out that information provided by these bottom-up inventories that I've been discussing today, the information that's already there is sufficient for immediate climate or air quality action. However, the value of atmospheric information is that it can help refine the emission estimates, particularly for sources where we have very limited information. However, there are a lot of challenges associated with this, challenges associated with what I'm calling, or what's called top-down emission estimates, which are largely derived from atmospheric observations or inverse modeling, and connecting those with information in these bottom-up inventories. And it's challenging to connect these two methods for a variety of reasons, partly due to differences in scale. So for instance, spatial and temporal differences. Also the required separation of natural or anthropogenic contributions. Under the IPCC framework, inventories are only include anthropogenic sources, whereas emissions that are derived from atmospheric observations, it takes a lot of work to separate out the natural versus anthropogenic contributions. And then there's also just differences in the available source-specific information. And so for instance, if you are deriving emission estimates over an oil and natural gas basin, you have those estimates as a function largely of the basin, or if you're deriving estimates of NOx emissions over a city, you derive citywide emission estimates. But the information that's used to build up the bottom-up estimates usually require facility level or even component level information. So there's, again, a mix match there in scale. And of course, each sector has its own challenges. But the coordination or the utility of incorporating atmospheric information into these bottom-up frameworks, that connection will depend on the design of the field study or the top-down estimates, the amount of detailed source-specific information that you can derive out of the top-down estimates. Of course, more detail is always better. And then I think it's very important to have engagement between the research and inventory compiler communities so that you can work together to find ways to build those connections. And there are additional resources on this topic. The 2019 refinements to the IPCC guidelines discuss this top-down, bottom-up comparison. And then there are 2 National Academy reports, which also provide some relevant information. So with that, I think here I just want to quickly plug a few of the EPA emission products in case you're unfamiliar. So on the left here, the US greenhouse gas emissions and sinks inventory. This is what's submitted to the UNFCCC every year for the US. We also have a greenhouse gas reporting program, which has facility level emissions that are reported by some of the largest emitting facilities around the nation. We have a global non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions projection and mitigation report, and then the National Emissions Inventory, which is the air pollutant emissions inventory that's also developed by the EPA every 3 years. So with that, I will return to my list of co-authors here and thank them again for their contributions to my postdoctoral work. And I will pause and take any questions. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks for your great talk. Very interesting. And I have quite a few questions, but Chuck is answering asking the first one. Are your exposure health impact estimates for outdoor air only, or they take into account indoor air quality and exchange between the atmosphere and the indoor environment?
Yes, that is a great question, Chuck. Thank you for asking that. Sorry, I wasn't clear. No, our results are only considering exposure to outdoor PM 2.5.
Yeah, but it all depends onto these response curves you were showing, right? And it really depends how those are determined, because if those are epidemiologically determined, people are exposed to both indoors and outdoors. Maybe it's a detail that you cannot know because it's too much detail, but what do you think? I mean, do you know any details or how those response curves are determined?
Yes, and I don't think I have those details in this presentation, but they're derived from a series of observational cohort studies as well as responses to, I believe, secondhand smoke. That's how you get the data points that are on the high end of the exposure levels. And so, yes, the curves themselves do account for exposure to indoor and outdoor air pollution. However, we are on those curves, kind of the x-axis, we're only looking for the response at the level of outdoor exposure. And then we are also applying, I didn't mention this, but we also apply a scaling factor at the end to account for the co-exposure to indoor air pollution. So yes, you're right, Ale, those curves do account for exposure to indoor air, but we've taken measures to separate out the indoor and outdoor components.
And then here we have Laura Pan asking, is the PM 2.5 related death maps published? Do you have references for that? And is there a population weighted death rate map in addition to the absolute death map?
Yes, so all of the results from our study are available, linked. I think it's in the data availability section of the Nature Communications paper, so McDuffie et al. 2021. If you're interested in the most recent global burden of disease project data, those are available online. There's an online tool called GBD Compare, which has it's like an interactive data visualization site that you can click around and look at not only attributable, not only deaths attributable to air pollution, but all other risk factors. And the data visualization site that I showed for GBD maps, all of that data comes from our study. So yes, that's all published and publicly available.
Awesome. It's a really cool tool that you showed. Andrea Wagner is asking, thank you for the talk. How can death be quantifiably attributed to PM2.5? And are there inventories for this data as well?
Yes, so this gets into the details of the exposure assessments and how the concentration response functions are actually derived. And so the details are there and in the GBD analysis and accompanying papers. But like I mentioned in a response to a previous question, the curves for the GBD are largely derived from observational cohort studies and various other exposure avenues. And yes, I'm sorry I don't have a lot of details here off the top of my head, but that is well documented science in kind of the health impact analysis world.
Okay, thanks. Next question, we had a couple more. So very nice talk. There has always been a disconnect between the community that does spot checks top down on the bottom-up emission inventories. What do you think are the best ways forward to help bridge the communication gap? From Eric Apple.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. These are all great questions. Yes, this is a huge challenge. And I think speaking from experience with the greenhouse gas inventory, one of the main issues is that the greenhouse gas inventory, of course, is showing national annual emissions of greenhouse gases. And so when you're trying to compare those to one-off or even repeated field studies or results that are derived from field campaigns, those of course are not happening over the course of an entire year, and those are happening in a very specific location. So I think one step is to spatially disaggregate the national inventories down to finer spatial and temporal resolution. And I'm actually currently working with researchers to do just that. So that will hopefully help. I mean, that won't solve everything, but that's one step forward. So trying to meet in the middle in terms of scale is going to be helpful. But I think more importantly, trying to answer this question, I think it's best if bottom up and top down communities can actually talk to each other more regularly and discuss some of the common challenges or difficulties in connecting this information and kind of brainstorm paths forward. Because I will tell you from experience that it doesn't help another paper coming out saying that bottom-up inventories are wrong by X%, like that's not going to help solve the problem of this disconnect. It's going to take the communities talking to each other to work out how to do this.
Okay, next question. See, from Peter Nell. I have a question about non-methane VOCs over Africa and one question about bottom-up, top-down comparison for emission database. Oh, more detailed formulation. Non-methane VOC regional comparison. I see a strong increase over Africa. What is that caused by?
Yes, that is a good question. And I would have to go back and look at that. Sorry, I don't have an answer to that off the top of my head. But for African countries, the emissions in our SEDS inventory are largely scaled to the available emissions in the DICE Africa inventory. And of course, they're only scaled for the sectors and compounds that are in the DICE inventory, but I know non-methane VOCs are in that inventory. So I would have to go back and look at that that inventory and that reference to be able to answer that question. So I apologize, I don't have an answer right now.
And then we have Anonymous asking if you have comments on current emission inventory of South Asia and Africa where measurements are limited.
I would say there's a lot of work to be done. Yeah, I mean, there are uncertainties in bottom-up inventories. Some sectors and some regions are more uncertain than others. So for instance, large point sources like large power plants, especially in countries like the US where those emissions are required to be reported, there are a lot lower levels of uncertainty for those than, for instance, residential emissions. So you have these small scattered sources, or waste burning is a huge source as well in developing countries, that those emissions are very uncertain.
Yeah. Okay, let's see if there is one more question. Yes, from Helen. Thanks for a great talk. More of a comment. The IGAC Amigo activity is trying to address the differences between bottom-up and top-down, mostly satellite observations. Cool.
Excellent. Helen, if you're involved with that, I will contact you about that.
All right. It's 4:31 here in Colorado, and so it's time to say goodbye. Thanks for your talk, Erin. It was super interesting, and thank you guys for joining us. See you next time.
Thank you.